Carlson from the Cox Media Group. She's been working as a user experience professional for 7 years, applying her background in psychology to understand how people use technology. With this knowledge, she strives to craft digital experiences that are intuitive and enjoyable. Patti has worked in various usability research and design roles in the telecommunications, automotive, and media industries. She's also passionate about introducing usability to new audiences, including children at a local elementary school's career day, as well as city officials embarking on a redesign of the City of Atlanta website. So I'm especially excited about Patti coming because I did want to talk about something that's already been brought up today, which is the user experience. And how do the users experience the OPAC if they do at all? And how can we think about that as we're developing out these requirements? So thank you, Patti. I'm going to give you the floor.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. It's really great to get out of the office and to be able to talk about something a little bit different from my day-to-day. And as Emily mentioned, I really am very passionate about talking about usability and introducing it to people who don't work with it on a day-to-day basis. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. So it's a pretty simple agenda for the presentation that I have for you. First, we'll talk about what usability is, why it's important, and then how do we create products that are usable and have good usability. So before we get into a definition of usability, I want to start with a sort of theoretical product design exercise. So sort of a thought experiment here. So let's say we want to design a container, and the specifications are here. It must be watertight. The capacity of the container should hold about ½ a gallon of water. It should have a handle that can be comfortably grasped by the hand of an adult, and it has a spout through which water can flow. So everybody kind of picture in your mind, what does this product look like? What do you think it looks like? So how did we do? So it meets all of the specifications. So this is a watering can, obviously, sort of. It meets the specifications that we specified on the previous slide, but for some reason it isn't exactly usable. And that's kind of the point that I want to get across, is that you need to go beyond written specifications and really consider how this product is going to be used, especially by the target audience. Who's going to be using this product and how are they going to be using it? So that was sort of a theoretical, conceptual example, but I want to show you some examples of bad usability in the real world. So the first image here is basically a sidewalk cutout that's supposed to make the sidewalk accessible. But something's missing here. Exactly, there's no sidewalk. So while they followed the rules and made this mandatory cutout in the sidewalk, without the sidewalk there, it's really kind of pointless. And then the bottom picture here is for a door, and there's 2 signs on the door. One of them says that it's an automatic door, and the other one says to push pad to open. So is it really an automatic door? If you have to push on something, if you have to actually do something to make it open? And really, what could be easier to use than a door? And this door has 2 signs on it. So would you consider this a usable product? I don't know, I think it needs some help. And here's the classic stovetop example. This range looks basically like any stovetop you've probably encountered. My stove looks very similar to this. I've been using my stove, in my house for 7 years, but I've been using a stove, as long as I've been able to cook. And yet, for some reason, I always have trouble knowing which knob goes to which burner. So if you look at the stovetop here, the burners are oriented side by side and top to bottom, so there's 2 rows. And then there's a single row of knobs to control each burner. And each knob, which you may not be able to see, but there's a tiny, tiny little diagram next to each knob with a little dot in the corner corresponding to which burner it goes to. And yet, for some reason, at least weekly, I turn on the back burner when I mean to turn on the front burner. Why is it so hard, you know? Why do we have, you know, this simple thing that's in everybody's home that everybody uses almost every day, depending on how much you cook, and we still to this day, after all these years, we haven't designed a stovetop that uses what we call natural mapping in order to make this more usable without having to think. So here is a picture of the cockpit of a 747. And the reason why I show this is to kind of talk about the study of usability and how things are designed for the people who use them. So usability grew out of the fields of human factors and ergonomics. And human factors and ergonomics really got its start during World War II when they were designing aircraft to improve aviation safety. So you see here basically a dizzying array of knobs and dials and buttons, which to us, you know, to the common person who's not a pilot, it looks very complicated and confusing. But the actual design of the cockpit has had a lot of thought put into it. And not only that, but research into how pilots use each of these instruments. So if you're a pilot, the way that the cockpit is arranged is actually an optimal arrangement for how you would use or how you would fly the plane. So the instruments that are right up front are the ones that you would use most often. The ones that are farther away from your, you know, where you're sitting are the ones that you would use less often. So obviously, a 737 cockpit is not designed for the average person, but it is designed for the needs of the pilot. And this is a photograph of the federal courthouse building in Jacksonville, Florida. And when I was in college, one summer I went to Jacksonville and I worked for a temp agency. And the project I was assigned to was to work for the architecture firm that was building this courthouse. And one of the things that you have to take into consideration when you're building a very large building like this is not only, you know, what materials are you going to use, you know, making sure everything is ADA compliant and that sort of thing, but how are people actually physically going to enter the building? How are they going to use the building? How are they going to get around the building? And one thing I learned that I thought was kind of interesting was that there were 3 separate elevator shafts. One elevator shaft was used specifically just by the judges. There was another elevator that was used just for the defendants. And then there was a separate elevator for the general public. And they did this out of safety considerations. So the judge could park his car, his or her car, and go straight from that area of the parking garage into the judge's elevators that would lead directly to the judge's chambers. Similarly, when they brought the defendant in, they would go to a separate area of the parking garage and go to a separate elevator section, and that elevator would lead directly to a holding cell that was right next to the courtroom. And this was, of course, separate from where the judge is. And obviously, you want to keep the judge safe from the defendant, and you want to keep the general public kind of separate from all of that. So I thought that was a really interesting example of how you really need to understand how your product, whatever you're building, whether it's an actual building or a watering can, you have to understand how it's going to be used by the people using it in order to know how to build it. So let's go ahead and get into some definitions of usability. The ISO definition is the extent to which a product can be used by specified users to achieve specified goals with efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction in a specified context of use. Okay, that's one definition of usability. Another definition is by Steve Krug, who's a great usability author, an author of great usability books. And his definition is making sure that something works well, that a person of average, or in some cases below average ability and experience can use the thing, whether it's a website, a fighter jet, or a revolving door, for its intended purpose without getting hopelessly frustrated. So I want to sort of boil those definitions down into some common elements. So first, efficiency, effectiveness, learnability, and satisfaction. These are things that products that have good usability, these are things that they would have. And the things that you want to reduce are errors and frustration. So that's the basic gist of what usability is and how you define something that has good versus bad usability. I also want to talk a little bit about how usability is different from other disciplines. So a lot of times people will come up to me and kind of talk to me as though I were a market researcher. But that's not exactly the case. It is a very separate discipline from market research. Usability is truly concerned with how easy an interface is to use and what are the user's needs. When you go down towards market research, you're starting to get into questions of what do consumers like and how do different options change behavior, such as buying behavior. And then there's another area, quantitative analysis of analytics. So if you have a website, for example, you can actually see what users are doing, what they're clicking on, what your conversion rate is. And that's sort of ways of measuring user behavior. So let's talk about now why usability is important. So when you dedicate yourself to the usability of a product, the users benefit because they are satisfied and not frustrated, hopefully. They're more likely to enjoy interacting with the product that you're building. They'll achieve their goals efficiently and effectively and have more confidence and trust in the product. But we're not doing this to be completely altruistic, right? So there's also benefits to the people who are building the product. Those are reduced development time and costs, reduced support costs, reduced user errors, reduced training time and costs, and return on investment. So it's great to be able to provide a product that's usable, but it also makes sense to do usability for your own benefit of reducing the time and the cost associated with developing a product. I want to share with you a couple of case studies for how, when usability research was put into effect, it improved a couple of things. So Foraker redesigned and redeveloped a community platform for breastcancer.org. And their redesign incorporated usability research and user-centered design principles. And after the redesign, they saw a 117% increase in traffic, 41% increase in new memberships, 53% reduction in time taken to register, and 69% reduction in monthly help desk costs, which all resulted in tens of thousands of dollars in savings for the organization. And then in 2005, FEMA found that through usability testing that there were a number of usability issues with their web page, including clutter on the home page, confusing information architecture, so the way the site was organized, unclear navigation, they weren't sure how to get to where they wanted to go. People were frustrated with out-of-date or inconsistent information on the website. And so after a redesign that addressed the issues that were found, they reported an 85% improved success rate and 71% improved satisfaction rate. So how do we go about creating usable products? And what we do is we use a process called user-centered design. which is a design philosophy and also a process in which the needs, wants, and limitations of end users of a product are given extensive attention at each stage of the design process. User-centered design can be characterized as a multi-stage problem-solving process that not only requires designers to analyze and foresee how users are likely to use a product, but also to test the validity of their assumptions with regard to user behavior in real-world tests with actual users. And what user-centered design tries to optimize, they try to optimize the product around how users can, want, or need to use the product, rather than forcing the users to change their behavior to accommodate the product. So really what you're doing here is you're just starting from the beginning to the end, keeping the users in mind. Who is the end user? How are they going to use the product? What issues are they going to have? And how are you going to address those? And within user-centered design, there's usually several different roles. So there's the information architect role, and that person determines how everything on the site or in the product, in the software, is organized. There are also interaction designers, and they determine what happens when a user clicks on a button, when a user hovers their mouse over something, all of those interactions. The graphic designer, the information architect and the interaction designers usually work together to create a wireframe layout and detailed functional specs. And a wireframe layout is basically just a skeleton of the page, just lines and boxes on a page. The graphic designer will then add the visual design on top of the wireframe. The developer, the software developer, will write the actual code, build the actual software. And a usability researcher, their job is to understand the target user and evaluate the product in terms of its ease of use for the target user. So those are 5 different roles that are usually involved in the user-centered design process. They might not represent 5 different people. So you might have one person who's the information architect, but also the interaction designer. You might have one person doing all 5 things. And here's a diagram of the user-centered design process. So as you can see, there's 5 stages here, starting with the planning stage. Planning is critical to the success of all projects, and this is also true of projects using user-centered design. In the planning phase, the team determines all of the user-centered design activities and ensures that the necessary resources are available. In the research phase, before you can design a product, it's imperative that you have a clear understanding of the user's goals and tasks, the market needs, and the related work. The third phase is the design phase, where you define your system from the user's perspective. Initially, this phase takes the form of use cases and task analysis, which describes a task that the system will support. And from these tasks, you would create the UI designs, or the user interface designs, beginning with rough sketches and ending with detailed UI design specifications. And then there's the adapt phase, which acknowledges that even the best conceived designs often need to be adapted when development begins coding. This adaptation can occur as a result of unforeseen limitations in the target technology, new requirements, or missing functionality in the initial design. And then the measurement phase. So when a product is released, it's possible to measure its usability quantitatively. These tests measure a product's effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. Also, something that the designers take into account is they tend to rely on best practices and standards. So they're not reinventing the wheel each time they're designing a new website or some new software. So an example of that are published accessibility guidelines, which you can find on the internet. And I believe I shared the link with Emily, and it's on the Loblolly site. So let's talk a little bit about some of the research methodologies that we can do in a user-centered design process. And I've split these up into methodologies to understand the user and other methodologies to evaluate the product. So if we look back at the user-centered design process, the research phase really speaks to the understand the user part of it, and the measure phase speaks to the evaluate the product phase. So there are multiple different methodologies you can use for each of these phases. To understand a user, you can use surveys. Contextual inquiry is where you actually find your target user and observe them before you've designed the product. Just kind of observe what they do. How do they use other technologies? Understand what sorts of limitations they have and what sorts of workarounds they've put in place. A card sort or affinity diagram is an information architecture exercise where you actually take pieces of content, write them on cards, and you ask the target user to sort them or group them into categories that make sense to them. And that's how you can help define an information architecture. Because remember, if there's a way that you would categorize content, it might not naturally map onto the way that your target user would categorize content. A diary study is sort of a longitudinal methodology where you ask your target user to keep a diary with them. You could ask them to write down ways that they use technology, some of the struggles that they have, and go back and look at that qualitative data. Personas are a design tool where if, for whatever reason, you have questions about how your target user would use your technology and you don't have access to that target user, you can develop personas that kind of describe a fictional character to kind of help you think through the process as that person. If you have access to any sort of data like help desk calls or any sort of questions or things like that have already been submitted for a previous product, that can help you understand your user as well. And on the evaluate product side, you can do something called an expert review where a usability analyst will actually go through the product and evaluate it either against some heuristic principles or just in a cognitive walkthrough type of situation where the usability analyst just kind of identifies issues that may come up. You could use a focus group where you put your product in front of people and just kind of get some feedback that way. Usability test is where if you have a prototype or a functioning product, you can actually have the person from your target group test it out and observe what kinds of issues they run into. If you have anybody in your competitive space, you can kind of look at what all is out there and how they have addressed some similar issues, either through a competitive audit or a competitive analysis. And standards inspection, that's where you look at sort of published guidelines and published standards to make sure what the product that you're building meets those standards. And I would say that if you're going to do any of these research techniques, that you should really focus on usability testing. And you can usability test early and often, and I think that's really where you get the most bang for your buck. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to actually do a usability test. So first, the goal of a usability test is to identify specific issues that prevent users from successfully completing tasks. And the way you do this is you find representative users, so people who would actually represent the people who would be using the product. Ask them to complete representative tasks, so identify tasks that would be typical for someone who's using this software, and ask them to go ahead and complete it while you observe quietly.
Not tell them how dumb they are.
Yes, you should not tell them how dumb they are. And so through this process, you can actually identify design and interaction issues, which you can address through the design. And sometimes this can be a painful or humbling experience, especially if you've had a hand in the design. And therefore, you should not get attached to any single design, concept, or idea as you're in the early phases. And I have to say that if you have the budget for a professional usability practitioner to do testing, that's wonderful. But if you don't, it's really something that you can do yourself. So we'll talk a little bit more about how usability testing is done. And a lot of people ask, well, how many users do you need for each usability test? You know, if we're doing this throughout the development process and you recommend doing it early and often, how many do we need for each of these iterative tests? And the answer lies in this graph that was created by Jacob Nielsen, who is a famous usability practitioner. And he found through lots and lots of testing that you can find close to 100% of the usability issues in a given product with about 6 users, between 6 and 9 users. So you really don't need a lot of users in each test. You can really just do very small tests throughout the development cycle that help you identify issues. You address those issues, keep developing, and then do another test. So in the process of usability testing, after you've identified issues, you provide recommendations, interpret the recommendations within the context of business goals and technical feasibility, and implement the ones that you can. If you want to learn more about usability, these are some books that I really recommend that are sort of the most famous usability books. The first one is Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. It's sort of a really basic handbook to why we do usability, how to do it, and why it's important. The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, and 100 Things Every Designer Needs to Know About People by Susan Weinschenk. So, any questions?